Hi, everyone. I hope you can all see me and hear me okay. We're going to make a start because it's 5:30 here in London, which is where I am. Yeah, I want to welcome you all to today's event, which is called A History of Future Contagion, which will see Candice Lin and Neel Ahuja in conversation with each other. Before I introduce myself, I just wanted to thank both the Courtauld Research Forum and Spike Highland Gallery in Bristol for helping myself and my co-organizer Sophie put this event together. And it's at Spike Highland where Candice Lin's work is currently being displayed in the exhibition Pigs and Poison, which is on until the 8th of May, I believe. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew. I'm a PhD student researching contemporary art at the Courtauld Institute of Art and London's Tate Museum. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Candice and Neel discuss their work today. Over to my co-organizer, Sophie, who is also right next to me in real life.
Hi, my name is Sophie Guo. I'm a PhD student in contemporary art here at the Courtauld. I'll briefly introduce the structure of today's event and our speakers. Candice Lin will give a 15 to 20 minutes presentation of her recent work. Then she'll join Neel Ahuja in a conversation. We'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end of the event. Please type your questions in the chat box as they come to mind, and you don't have to wait until the end. Candice Lin was born in Concord, Massachusetts, USA. She lives and works in Los Angeles, where she is assistant professor of art at UCLA. Through her multidisciplinary work, Candice probes into marginalized histories, colonialism, immigration, alternative kinship, and racialization of disease and contagion. She has exhibited at museums and biennials internationally, including Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Guangdong Times Museum in Guangzhou, Logan Center for the Arts, University of Chicago, Gasworth in London, among others. Neel Ahuja is visiting professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, and professor of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the UC Santa Cruz. He is the author of 2 books, Bioinsecurities, Disease Interventions, Empire and the Government of Species, published in 2016, and Planetary Spectres, Race, Migration, and Climate Change in the 21st Century, published last year. He has written essays on the connections of race and colonialism to the fields of disability studies and animal studies. He's currently researching race and species politics of COVID-19, while also analyzing US counter-terrorism incarceration, rendition, and interrogation practices. So without further ado, Candice, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sophie. I'd like to thank both Sophie and Andrew for the invitation to be in conversation with them, and with Neel Ahuja, who I feel like I'm a little more nervous than usual because Neel Ahuja is a scholar whose work I deeply admire, and he's so brilliant. I'm a little nervous to measure up. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about a couple of images from the current show that is on view at Spike Island right now, as well as related works. I thought I would focus my slides on some of the works that use materials that materials that have non-human animals involved, either in some of the matter like lard or bone black pigment, as a way to connect to Neel's work on what he's called the interspecies zone of the political. Neel's work has been really important to my thinking and practice. I really admire the detailed analyses and case studies where he traces imperial and colonial projects through specific instances that often involve the lives of other species in relationship to ideas of contagion. So to start with, this is an image from the current show that's on view at Spike Island, Pigs and Poison. And it shows a sculpture of a life-size wooden trebuchet, which was a kind of medieval catapult weapon. And I made this sculpture to reference one of the early moments of biological warfare that's recorded in European history. During the 14th century, during the siege of Kaffa, there was an Italian account that wrote that Mongols purportedly used this trebuchet to sling the diseased bodies of horses, livestock, and possibly human corpses who had died of the plague into the city so that the city would become infected and the siege could be broken. It was also an early instance where this disease that then spread into Europe was kind of flagged as Asiatic in origin. So at Spike Island, an attendant periodically puts on this tapestried cloak that has a woven design of a drawing I made of a plague virus. And they fire projectiles made out of oil, bone black pigment, wax, and lard. And this projectile goes over this barricade sculpture and accumulates on the wall behind it. So you can see it better there. And those are the projectiles on the right. I've been using lard in my sculptures for the last couple of years in a couple of different forms. So one of them is the projectiles that you see on the right there, mixed with bone black pigment. Lard is also a material that's used to make these fleshy sculptures that are scattered around the installation that are purring. And I also use lard as the medium that I'm using to make these paintings. So these paintings are made out of wax, encaustic wax, lard, and pigment. And so lard relates also to the title of the exhibition, Pigs and Poison, which was a phrase used in the 19th century to describe the linked economies of the opium trade and the coolie trade, the trade of indentured Asian laborers who were sent across the globe to work on plantations, as well as doing mining and railroad work and guano harvesting and other forms of hard labor. And they were a specific group of indentured labor that was seen as being this transitional force as different countries were moving out of slavery. I also used lard recently in Louisiana in my installation at Prospect 5 Triennial at UNO Gallery. And the reference here was slightly different. I was thinking about it in relationship to the slaughterhouse cases, which were the first legal cases that tested the 14th Amendment. And it came about because the Mississippi River was clogged with the carcasses of animals. And this animal waste was polluting the water and causing waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera. So the state wanted to regulate the slaughterhouses, and the white butchers that were affected by the regulation, specifically in relationship to some of the regulations forcing the integration of these previously segregated business spaces, brought the case against the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was, I realize this is a UK context. In the US, the 14th Amendment was the amendment created to protect newly emancipated slaves and is kind of an articulation of human rights. And so it's kind of ironic that the first case brought in relationship to it to test it actually came from a kind of opposite force politically. And I was interested in the way that this literal animality of the animal bodies, non-human animal bodies in the river, and also the kind of language of animality associated with specific racial groups was intertwined in these kind of legal cases that describe what is the human rights, what is citizenship, who qualifies for these things. So this installation had a scented lard and scented candles that I made from wax and lard. And the lard was infused with the scent of decaying rats. using a French perfuming technique called enfleurage. And these offerings were placed into ceramic sculptures of swamp animals and poured into plaster scagliola sculptures. The ceramics, I should say, were also made out of clay that I dug out of, or I didn't do it. I'm like forgetting. Because of COVID, I hired somebody who, Caleb Works, who went to the site of St. Malo, which was the first Asian settlement in the US, and it was in Louisiana, and it no longer exists, but it was a site that Filipino indentured workers in the 18th century settled in when they jumped ship during their transportation to Spanish colonies, and was a site that later Chinese indentured workers, Indian indentured workers, and other people fleeing different work and life conditions went and lived in. So I had Caleb dig this clay to me, send it to me in US priority mail boxes, and I made the ceramic sculptures out of this clay, and they were filled with the scented lard. St. Malo was also a fugitive slave maroon colony, and the name, sometimes people think the name comes from a maroon leader who had the name Jean St. Malo. So there's also this kind of imagining I'm doing of this multiracial space in the swamp and the possibilities of how those different communities may have intersected. And just wanted to say also that the scagliola I mentioned is this kind of marbled meat looking stuff that the ceramics are resting on top of, and that that's a material made from mixing pigment, plaster, and hide glue, which is made from boiling animal bones. Okay, so I was interested in this kind of use of the animal matter in relationship to ideas of the human and citizens. And this, you know, obviously with the indentured laborers, they were called pigs in the phrase "pigs in poison." That was reference to a kind of pejorative reference to the indentured laborers. And they were also kind of animalized by their proximity to, or the fact that they ate or lived alongside vermin. So in this case, these paintings that I made for Pigs in Poison depict a number of different things. This one is an image showing how rats were tracked during the bubonic plague outbreak at the turn of the late 1800s to early 1900s in San Francisco. And they were tracking these rats as a way to test them for bubonic plague and also to pinpoint the source, which they believed to come out of Chinatown. And as a result of a lot of the kind of fears of contagion coming from Chinatown, not only in San Francisco, but in other places in the US, these neighborhoods were often burned and militarized. This is an image of the Honolulu, Chinatown, where military were sent in to kind of cordon off, here, I'll show you this research image, cordon off the Chinatown residents and then forcibly destroy parts of their buildings that were deemed diseased or sites of contagion that could be spread. So that's the military on the right there before sanitizing. This image was also San Jose. On the left, San Jose, Chinatown before it was burned, and below, white spectators watching it burn. The right image is white spectators watching San Francisco's Chinatown burn. And then this is an image of the horse-drawn carriage that was spraying disinfectant on the different buildings, and on the right, the wrecking crew brought in to tear down buildings. Another part of my research in pigs and poison was also learning about how immigration policies that we have today at the US-Mexico border were shaped by this 19th century Chinese migration and the exclusion laws that came out of it. So this second series of paintings, also made with lard and encaustic wax and pigment, reference this connection. Here's some research images that are showing how to distinguish between a Chinese indentured worker trying to cross the border illegally and a legal, at the time, Mexican worker who was allowed to cross the border. These images are of pig carcasses dressed in human clothes, and they come from UCLA professor Jason de Leon's long-term anthropological study called the Undocumented Migration Project, where he used the bodies, him and his team used the bodies of pigs as surrogates for humans. And this was a way to kind of track how the body decomposed, was lost or spread across what kind of spatial range in the desert. And it was done with the goal of revising the kind of low estimate of lives lost in the Sonoran Desert. And then this is a really early piece from 2011, 2012. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the Latin phrase bacium subcauda, kiss under the tail. And it's a sculpture of a Haitian Creole pig that's projecting an animation from its asshole onto the wall behind it at pig size and pig height. The animation narrates the 1982 slaughter of Haitian pigs at the hands of U.S. agribusiness. This was the time where there was swine flu detected in the Dominican Republic in 1978, and U.S. agribusiness wanted to protect their interests and were worried about the spread of swine flu, so they ordered the eradication of all local Haitian pigs, and known as Creole pigs. And this was an eradication that destroyed a lot of the Haitian rural livestock economy, because pigs were used to pay for education, mortgages, unexpected medical bills. And the US intervention replaced these local hardy pigs with these fragile pink pigs that you can see in this still from the animation that required special animal feed that the US companies were then also paid to supply. And this eradication of the Haitian Creole pig, which I guess is coming back, I just read something recently, was named one of Haiti's top agricultural disasters alongside the subsidization of the local rice industry, which the US also did, that also decimated the local rice farming economies. I feel like I'm going on for maybe a little long, so I'll try to wrap up. The background here is this. Sorry, this installation is part of the Pigs and Poison at Spike. This is the back corner of the installation that shows this mural, which is drawn from a photo of Chinese indentured workers on the Milodon sugarcane plantation in Louisiana. The mural is painted with bone charcoal pigment, which is also the pigment that I mentioned was mixed into the lard projectiles that the trebuchet was shooting off. And also just to say that this figure in the foreground is meant to be a kind of bird-like plague doctor and has a virtual reality headset inside of it and is echoing the witness sculpture in the back there. Bone charcoal was used in sugar refining to remove the brown color and render it more white. And I became interested in the material because it's something that's used both in industry and also still in fine art. Bone black pigment is a really common black pigment used in painting still. And I came across it in 2016 in my research into porcelain, where I was reading about processes of filtration and refining of goods that were made more valuable through their ideas of being whitened and purified. So like sugar that was purified with bone charcoal, I at the time was researching how porcelain was also prized for its whiteness and used as a water filtration device. And then when I was learning about Chinese indentured labor in the US and the Caribbean, I read the 1873 Cuba Commission report, which was a report made after Chinese government officials went to Cuba and interviewed the workers there about their work conditions. And one of the interviewees, or actually a couple of them, said in the transcript that there were a lot of suicides of these workers trying to escape these work conditions, and that even after death, they didn't escape desecration because their bodies were often left unburied and heaped with the bodies of livestock and burned into bone charcoal, and that bone charcoal was used to refine the sugar to make it more white. Yeah, so I think I'll end there. I was going to talk a little bit about the use of plants. These are plant tinctures that were at the Times Museum installation, which shows a little bit larger of a mural that also shows the bone charcoal being used in the sugar refining process next to the sugarcane image. And these tinctures are tinctures of plants that have to do with this history of indentured labor. So there's sugarcane, tobacco, opium poppy, and indigo mixed with herbs that come from plague remedies, medieval plague remedies. And these were here for visitors to ingest if they wanted to. And I was just really interested in bringing that act of ingestion into the space of the exhibition, since I was thinking about how these materials and environments and plants and animals are entangled and consumed and used together with our bodies as humans and our human histories. And then I won't talk about these because I feel like I just rambled on for too long. Okay, I'm sorry. I was weirdly nervous.
Well, I'm so excited that we get to talk about this work, and there's no reason for you to be nervous. I'm just so glad that we all get to grapple with the kind of historical associations that you've put together here. And I, part of what is so brilliant about the types of juxtaposition that are happening in this exhibit is that they're both kind of urgently present with the concerns around biowarfare, the circulation of many species of matter that are putting bodies both at risk and are also allowing certain forms of capital to continue. But what's most striking for me is the brilliant kind of historical connections that are made here. And I'm just thinking, I want to focus in on basically two of the images that you shared with us. One of them is that of the trebuchet that's catapulting these, fleshly pieces of viral risk out into the world, and yet they are purring upon upon landing. And the other one is the image of the lard seeping out into the river and being kind of that critical material that is bringing to bear a whole history of human enslavement and also interspecies fleshly exchange into conversation. So, if I'm allowed to riff on these amazing images, one of the things that immediately came to mind here is that Candice, your work is thematizing the circulatory nature of interspecies connections in racial capitalism. So what I mean by that, and I think about this with the image of the catapult kind of flinging parts of bodies into the world, we're seeing there not only a kind of sense of biowarfare, of the fact that certain bodies, when they come into contact, are putting each other at risk. But also part of this is the kind of historical way that those movements, which are often unexpected or perceived as invasive, are deeply productive of long-term histories that we inhabit today. So the fact that the fear of plague was racialized as coming from a kind of Asiatic East is it's previewing for us many of the discourses that are emergent today around COVID-19. But it's also connecting to other histories of biowarfare and the expansion of capitalism that need to be grappled with if we're to make sense of the positions not only of Asian Americans and other Asian diasporic peoples, but the complicated relationships among racially minoritized groups today. What I'm thinking about here is something that comes up for me with the lard, actually. The lard reminded me of that moment during the Inquisition in Spain, and also in other moments at which Muslims and Jews in Europe were being cast out. And the lard was what separated the fat, the use of the fat, the lard versus the olive oil was what separated one group from another. The kinds of mass population reduction that we saw with the bubonic plague did itself energize this history of racial capitalism and the rise of the Atlantic slave trade in ways that might not always seem perceptible. I was recently teaching Cedric Robinson's work from the book Black Marxism, and the moment that Robinson in chapter 1 of that book talks about the plague, he's talking about how with these massive population changes in Europe, with the rise of peasant rebellions, the fates of those people who started the slave trade, the Genovese bourgeoisie, came about in a way that might have been unexpected. One group of powerful merchants replaced another after the Black Death. And the fact that plague displaced an emerging bourgeoisie and allowed those traders who ended up kind of fomenting the Atlantic slave trade to come about seems like it could be an incident of history, but to the extent that humans are always, especially in settler colonial relations, are always moving around humans, animals, viruses, and other plagues, this particular moment that we see crystallizing the emergence of middle-class traders who would eventually bring enslaved peoples to the Americas is indicative of the ways that colonialism is expansive, is circulatory, and embeds ecologies of a lot of different species that we might not otherwise see put together. So that moment of biowarfare, the catapulting of flesh, also reminds me of Bouquet and Amherst's war against the Ottawa, the settler colonial use of biological weapons in early North America, that cleared the conditions for the Atlantic slave trade and also for a kind of westward colonization that would bring about what we end up calling the United States, bring about what we end up calling Canada and these other settler colonies. So I think, Candice, your work is so brilliantly juxtaposing these historical moments that show us the histories of racial capitalism, that show our embeddedness in each other's and each other's species, fleshly materiality, in a way that is more urgent than ever right now. Part of what we learn about the COVID-19 outbreak is that it is embedded in many of these interspecies ecologies, whether they be with the breeding of animals for food, whether it be with the expansion of urbanization and trade along routes that are coming into contact with areas that were once more wild. And these forms of vulnerability that are experienced in the times of a pandemic are, not the only forms of viral circulation that are happening. Behind the scenes of COVID-19, there's many other types of death being circulated along these same routes. And I think that, reminding us of this long-term history of anti-Chinese sentiment in the US, but also the ways that other racialized Asian American groups get drawn into anti-Asian sentiment is critical at this moment. One of the things that has come up in the research about vulnerability to COVID-19 in both the UK and the US is the way that although it's understood that especially people from the African diaspora have been significantly affected, more so than white populations in both of these countries, often Asian American deaths and caseloads are undercounted, and the way the statistics are collected make it seem like Asian Americans are faring better than all other racial groups, when in fact, when you disaggregate them, you find out, for example, that Chinese Americans had a very high death rate compared to other groups, and that South Asian Americans had a very high case rate compared to other groups. But when that data is kind of conglomerated and made generic, we lose some of that materiality that Candice's work is so, pointing us towards. So part of my own work these days is thinking about the unequal immunological labor that is going on when racialized minorities take on a greater share of the social burden of disease. So the fact that pigs featured so prominently in your works made me think of the herd, made me think of the figure of livestock, and the way that COVID-19 epidemiology is configured through the idea of the herd, and how humans are the herd, and yet humans are also racially differentiated. So one of the studies that looks at herd immunity thresholds actually argues that in Long Island, in New York, the case rates were so much higher among Latinx Americans in the first wave of COVID-19 and the first surge there in the broader New York metro area, that the actual moment at which the population was designated to cross the herd immunity threshold was something that was brought about only because larger and larger numbers, 4 times as many Latinx people, experienced illness with COVID and thus experienced larger numbers of deaths. And that brought about a situation where then the case rates could drop for everyone, including those other groups that did not have as high case rates. So teasing apart these embodied vulnerabilities and fleshly interactions between species and across borders is one of the most urgent things that we have to think about in the context of the multiple pandemics we inhabit, right? So part of the response to COVID and the determination of racialized inequalities under COVID has been generated not only by public health data, but also by the movement against police violence and incarceration, not only in the US, but around the world. So we saw this discourse emerge about the intersecting pandemics of racism and COVID-19, in part after protests for Black Lives Matter break out in Minneapolis and then circulating in the summer of 2020 around the world. Mm-hmm. I think that Candice's work brilliantly thematizes the historical and the spatial relationships that force us to think about the ethical and political stakes of all of this. And by starting with something as mundane as the ways that individual animal bodies come into contact with these larger forms of circulation, capitalist forms of food economy, the larger trades in commodities that have come under duress during COVID, points to the ongoing nature of challenges to fight the imbrication of racial inequality within capitalism on a global scale. So I'm more than inspired by this work, and I'm excited to talk about it more with you, Candice, and with everyone in the audience. Thanks as well to Sophie and Andrew for all your work to get this going.
That was amazing. Also, I realized I should have turned my camera off. I was just like here listening to you.
Oh, it was so good to talk directly to you. And even though I'm so sad I can't be at Spike Island for this, so.
Me too. Yeah, I mean, this is why I was nervous. That was really brilliant, Neel. Just also so many things that maybe I should have thought about in my work. I hadn't even really thought about the kind of religious component and the kind of way that historically was used as this kind of way to separate groups of people, and seems really obvious now, but I just hadn't crossed my mind.
Oh, I mean, it's something that I think about all the time because of what's been going on in India, specifically around, the kind of fascist rise of Hindu concern around cow slaughter, which brings up a longer history of, you know, bullets encased in lard in colonial India. You know, something that I'm thinking about a lot, but that is at the heart of a long historical lineage of racialization. That race is not just about, you know, phenotypes and distinguishing things like skin color. It's about these cultural practices. It's about the way that we eat. It's about the ways that we coexist with other species in our ecologies. And so that was something you brilliantly captured as a political question when talking about the 14th Amendment, when talking about neoliberal agricultural change in Haiti. These are things that are all connected, and yet the standard academic narratives that people like me write about them can't capture those long-term historical juxtapositions that you do. But now I feel like I've babbled, and maybe others have questions. I don't know, Andrew and Sophie, if you want us to talk more, or if you want to talk more, or.
Well, yeah, I want to say thanks, Candice, for that amazing presentation, which definitely didn't feel kind of rambly to me at all, and also Neel for your response. Before like I or anyone else dived in with questions, I suppose I wanted to ask, give you both the opportunity to ask each other any other questions that you have. Do you have any more questions for each other, or are there things that you wanted to talk about which you haven't been able to talk about yet?
I probably will have questions, but I feel like that was so amazing. I'm still like, it's going to take me a while to digest it and like, yeah, think through it all. But it gave me all these other things I hadn't thought about to reflect on. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about, you know, clearly we're both people who are interested in like the detritus of bodies, like weird weird ways that humans, animals, viruses, other forms of life, plant matter, get caught up in these forms of circulation. And I'm just like so interested in your process and the archival aspect of it, and like you know, especially since all of your bookmarking had so many cute cats in it too. I'm wondering how you pull out the moments that are most kind of like intriguing to you, because I find that sometimes when you're trying to talk about these interspecies things, you just have to do an ultimately anthropomorphic exercise, which is to just try to imagine what the difference in a life world is for a virus, or like a cow or a pig or a cat. And so I don't know how you go about that kind of thought experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I do my share of anthropomorphizing for sure. I mean, my research show that was at the Carpenter Center and the Walker was kind of, it's not really, I was going to say it's about cats, but it's not really. It's about histories of indigo, colonial histories. My cat and other cats find their presence in it. But the thing I didn't talk about at the end, where I showed some images of the drawings related to the tinctures, is one way I try to like do that, I think, is like, so those are made after ingesting a tincture that I've made for 6 weeks, and drawing the kind of image of whatever comes to mind while that plant is in my body. And so I think that's maybe one way thinking about like what images come up in these like much more loose, intuitive ways, just through matter being together. And then other times it's just like, yeah, like an image that I'll come across in a book or something I'll read that isn't usually the stuff that's not like very explained, that is just like a little footnote or something. Will sometimes make me think of something I want to make. And I think part of why I'm nervous is because like as an artist, we don't maybe know how to articulate as verbally like all these nuances of the connections between things, but I feel like I feel it more on a material level. And then it's always a struggle to like put it into words, which I can do okay when I'm not in the presence of like an academic that I really respect. But yeah, I'm self-conscious now because of that.
No, well, I honestly, I'm just so amazed that I get to talk about your work, and maybe our cats can collaborate sometime soon. She heard you say the word cat, and she just came right over.
Roger's in some corner. I think he's hunting something. He went over there and he's like looking at a corner really fixedly. So
We have a few questions that come up. I'll just read some of them to you. Annie asked Candice, she said that she went to your exhibition last week and found the juxtaposition of the symbolic and totemic pieces with narrative paintings extremely useful, not only as a point of education and illustration, but also as a continuous reinforcement of the powerful and visceral impact of your work. She's asking whether this is always part of your practice.
hmm. I'm not sure which works Anne thinks of as the symbolic totemic pieces, but yeah, I feel like my work, actually the work is kind of shifting. I feel like in the past the work would often have, like the paintings have specific research photos that they're referencing. So those are like much more direct references. Um, but it's always been important to me to leave room in my practice for maybe more intuitive or speculative um, things that get introduced into the work that I don't maybe understand yet how they directly connect to um, the research in as much of a one-to-one way. So maybe that's what Anne's asking. And yeah, I feel like that is something I'm interested in a lot of my different installations, and maybe even moving more in that direction, like allowing myself that latitude.
Thank you. I actually have a question for both of you, and it's something that I want to ask partly because I think you've both sort of touched on it already. Neel, you mentioned thinking something to the effect of, putting yourself in the position of a virus or thinking about the life world of a virus and kind of non-human entities or entities that are supposedly, in a different sit in a different position on the kind of scale of animacy. And my question is about the role of speculation and kind of fantasy and the imagination in both of your work and your process, actually. Candice, you mentioned that you were trying to imagine the multiracial space of the swamp. In relation to one of the works in this exhibition that you talked about. And Neel as well, I think in one of your articles, I think it was Intimate Atmospheres, I think there's a reference to Octavia Butler and kind of science fiction and thinking along those lines. So I wonder if either of you or both of you could talk about, the role of fabulation and the speculative in your work and your process. Hopefully that question makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I don't know if you want to go first or what. You want me to go? Okay. Well, yes, I find that it's a kind of double bind to try to write to try to work in worlds of human representation that are then attempting to explain forms of perception or ways of embodying an ecology or inhabiting an ecology that are in some sense outside of human experience. And I'm always a bit concerned or hesitant when I go into those experiments because I know part of the context we're in of ecological collapse is one in which, the settler colonial states have created a sense of crisis and a kind of nostalgia for a lost connection to ecologies that in fact have persisted, and that there have been ways that such forms of knowledge have been maintained, persisted, and various activist groups and forms of indigenous knowledge have tried to preserve. So I'm always wondering if the speculation into the non-human life world is kind of performing that settler colonial nostalgia for a supposed lost ecology that actually hasn't been lost, that is actually persisting around us. But that said, I think that the imagination, to the extent that we can extend it beyond the colonial contours of human experience, is absolutely necessary at this moment when we're trying to think about what it means to live in a mass society that has been impacted by a pandemic, and where that pandemic has much to do with the ways that humans are in various parts of the world are intervening ecologically in systems that are already occupied by many other species that might have new forms of contagion that they're dealing with within their own species, and that can erupt into human communities in complicated ways. And I think that so much of what we don't know about COVID and beyond COVID needs to be grappled with. The fact that we're learning that something called long COVID, which has huge numbers in the UK, is a post-viral disease that looks like many other kinds of post-viral conditions, means we really need to think about what it means that we've set up a global economy that is geared towards circulating interspecies viral transmission on global routes. I personally feel like I've experienced several bouts of other viruses prior to COVID that were doing this kind of work, and I think we don't yet have. We need to acknowledge the hubris to think that we're able to contain these things, to understand them off the bat without further reflection and thinking about the ways that we inhabit the ecologies that we do. So that current unsustainable system that is driven by oil, that is also about transnational shipping and huge manufacturing that's being done for the international markets, understanding the life worlds that are created and destroyed through those processes is something that is not enough on the agenda of just the media and academic representation. And so I'm so glad that Candice, your art is bringing this right to the fore at the moment when it's most critical.
Yeah, no, I really resonate with what you're saying around, I was asked to teach a residency at Banff Center for the Arts this summer, and the theme was kind of on natural matter or whatever, and there was a lot of crafting we were doing around the description, because there's already a residency on queer ecologies, but my description I think at first was too close to that, but I really wanted to be no, I'm not really thinking about whatever that means, natural matter being transformed in this nostalgic way. I'm actually interested in how these kind of environmental things intersect with these histories of racialization and violence. And yeah, and I guess for me, when I think about, there's been a couple of artworks where there was this video I made, Toxic Semiotics, where it's a text I wrote. The voiceover is a text that I wrote from the point of view of a virus or a yeast. And I think for me, it's not, there's no real, there's also a moment where it becomes the human. I think there's no moment where I think I really know what that subject position feels like or thinks about. But it's more for me a strategy to shift the scale, maybe to think about what do we learn if we can think about the human as a landscape for this other being, and how it's in the video. This viral yeast is also a chemical waste that's shipped around the world, which mirrors a lot of histories of that actually happening and continuing to happen. But the viral yeast is kind of talking about its motivation and its desire to kind of like move through these colonies, which are humans. And so for me, I guess it's like, also when I talk about cats, it's not, I mean, I like to spend a lot of time imagining what my cat thinks about, but I don't know that I ever have a fantasy that I can. But spending time there wondering, I think, is also about connection and like perspective shift. So I think it comes into my work more as like a creative way to try to imagine a shift in scale, a shift in impact, a shift in priorities and motivations.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
I guess I have a question that echoes Annie's question earlier on. I guess it's about the trope of horror and the referentiality of material and form, I guess. I found the curatorial decision to juxtapose the vermin visionary, the infected lump, and the paintings of the pig carcass that kind of references the body of the migrant in the desert, particularly powerful in terms of the affect and the sense of horror, the sense of infectious fear embedded in it. And I've read somewhere in from an article that Candice, you said that fantasy and projection of disease through the lens of Renaissance fairs or video games is something that you are interested in. So I'm wondering how video games inform your work. Because I somehow found the infected lump, the sculpture of the infected lump kind of remind me of the lumps in the Resident Evil game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know very much about video games. I never really grew up playing them or anything. I just was interested in, I think it came about that you're talking specifically about the connection between the lump sculptures and the virtual reality headset, which has a fleshy, bloody version of the lumps being thrown at the viewer and then kind of piling and overcoming the body of the viewer. When they look down, they see their feet kind of disappearing into these lumps. And I guess I was thinking about the Tarkovsky film Solaris, which visually the spaceship looked like the Times Museum, or one of the sites where this exhibition was staged. And I was wondering, like, what would a video game version of that, the idea in that film is like this idea of the sentient planet that returns your histories that you can't deal with, that are kind of repressed and traumatic. And I was thinking that in the film, it's like done in a personal narrative way. I was wondering if we thought about that in a national way, like what would that look like as a video game? I don't know. Yeah, it was a loose idea of like my idea of what a video game looks like, of a Russian film about national amnesia. So it's not really that connected to video games, but it is connected to like, yeah, those kind of aesthetics maybe.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, possibly two, but I think one. And it's from Robert Leckie. Robert says, picking up on the juxtapositions that keep being mentioned, please could you, Candice, talk about how the show began to come together as a whole, as a kind of curatorial or editorial process? Each of the works orbit the same themes, but also pull in different directions to some extent, with references spanning the siege of Cafa in the 14th century to the undocumented journeys of migrants across the Mexico-US border. In the process, these different contexts bring new perspectives to works that you may have just encountered, but might have interpreted differently. I'm interested in how the exhibition's overarching narrative, if you can call it that, comes together, how the individual stories and materials of the different works all become bound up together. So yeah, could you talk about how the show came together as a curatorial or editorial process?
I feel like there's the right answer that Robert probably has in mind, and I'm not sure if I remember. Okay, so no. Okay, well, it was a long time ago. So the show started getting formulated in end of 2018, beginning of 2019. I was coming out of my research into porcelain and porcelain's use as a filter to study diseases. One of the diseases was the tobacco mosaic virus, which I learned about from Zhifei Cheng's work. And so I was thinking about, I wanted to learn more about, so that was like, I guess, one of the viruses that helped scientists understand that there was such a thing as viruses. And I was really intrigued that the birth of virology maybe comes from this moment using racialized material like porcelain, and the tobacco itself was described as going woolly and yellow when it got disease. So there's a kind of racialization of that. And I didn't really know anything about the history of virology, and also was interested in like it seems like there's obvious connections between disease histories and race, but I wanted to like know more about them. So I started researching them. And then as I was researching into this and the way that the Chinese indentured labor, that kind of came from a different corner, actually. So there's the porcelain researcher on virology, and then I did a residency in the Dominican Republic in 2018, and was trying to like think about the history of Chinese indentured labor in the Caribbean, and that those kind of researches, different research fields, which are very related, obviously kind of found an intersecting moment there. And then, I don't know, I guess like learning about the Chinese indentured laborers and a lot of the US like immigration policies I had known about, but didn't really realize was connected to those movements of labor coming into the US at this particularly politically charged time around the emancipation of slavery. Yeah, I guess that, I don't know. I don't know how to answer this question. It's like, it was just very organic. Like there were things I was in residence researching. There were things that came out of the last series of shows I did, A Hard White Body, which was on porcelain. And then, he's saying sorry. And then you just keep reading, and then other things find their way in as like little puzzle pieces, maybe. And I should say, like, as many Robert knows and other people know, but the research on disease and race came before the COVID-19 outbreak. It was researched in the end of 2018. So it just weirdly became timely, because it always is. Therefore, the title of this talk, right, which is also the title of one of the works.
We have a couple of minutes left, so it's probably getting time to wrap up, unfortunately. These things always feel too short to me, anyway. But before we finish, I don't know if Candice or Neel, there is anything else that you wanted to say, any thoughts that have been bubbling up? I like to give people that opportunity before abruptly ending. Maybe we could go. We could go to a question otherwise. If there is nothing bubbling up, I think it's IO. I think that's an I. Asks, do you get any maybe more negative comments about the use of animal products within your work relating to current environmental issues? Candice.
I've been waiting for them, but I haven't. Yeah, I was told about the militant vegans in Bristol, and I'm like very aware of like the kind of, like the question when you're an artist is like, are you reinscribing the traumas and politics that you're trying to talk about and critique? And I think my work is guilty of that. I think it's a really hard thing to parse. I don't know if one can make work in a space of moral purity or like outside of those implications. I'm sure there's ways I can like continue to be more thoughtful about how I do that. The lard, the use of lard came, I first started doing that with the work in Louisiana, where I asked Prospect's team to send me lard from local New Orleans butcher shops. So in that case, I kind of knew, the sourcing of the lard, but then the lard for these works, I don't know. Yeah, no, I mean, it's an open thing. I'm open to the criticism. I hear it implied. I've also worked with insects and plants in the past, and people, have issues with that, and I understand those issues. But I have persevered in using these materials because they're important to certain narratives I want to talk about, and I feel it's important that the matter itself is present in the work. Yeah.
As a longtime vegan, I can say that I think the most important place to do that activism is at the industrial agriculture level. Although, I'm not saying that there's no ethical concerns with using materials that are, whether they're human derived, animal derived, etc. Like the scale of the thing that we have to confront is something larger. And, I think that your use of those materials is pushing the question, actually, of what it means that we have entire industries with deeply racialized labor forces that are using these materials, generating them, that are creating whole populations of animals for those materials to be generated. And your brilliant ways of talking about how humans have also ended up in the muck, in the bone charcoal, in a sense, in the lard of the system is what we need to pay attention to.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Candice and Neel, for such an insightful and fascinating conversation. We hope that everyone enjoyed it, and thank you to everyone for coming and for asking your questions. Yeah, have a good rest of your day, whatever time zone you are on. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.